Post-war societal changes. The baby boom was among the most powerful influences on 20th century American life. Starting in 1946, millions of babies were born each year. At every step and stage of their development, these babies forced and required changes in the American economy. When they were 4 years old, kindergartens needed expansion, and when they turned 11, middle schools had to be rebuilt. When these baby boomers turned 18, colleges and universities had to find new seats and dorms, and when they turned 25 or so, the housing market had to expand. American culture, then, fundamentally changed. But when the baby boomers looked back on their early lives, they tended to say that growing up in the new suburbs of the 1950s was the single most important factor in their development. The suburbs. Most new housing construction of the late 1940s was in the relatively new suburbs, towns that surrounded the great urban centers. Many new companies and corporations were established on the basis, or with the goal, of creating new housing for the returning U.S. servicemen. The first planned community was Levittown, New York, named for developer William Levitt. This new community featured homes built at nearly the same time, often done by nearly the same construction company. As a result, the homes and lawns were arranged in almost identical fashion. Critics, naturally, pointed to the lack of home individuality, while enthusiasts raved about the standardization of streets, signs, and even the replaceable parts of the various homes. The typical American suburban husband now worked 30 or even 40 miles away, often in the downtown of a major city. Though he liked to drive, the suburban husband was often dropped off by his wife at the train depot in the early morning, and he took a combination of train and subway to his office work in the big city. The defining aspect of his work was that he was a white-collar worker, meaning he wore a business suit and expected it to remain clean throughout his 8 or 9 hour day. This was very different from his father and grandfather, both of whom wore overalls to work, overalls that became very dirty in an average day. Of course, there were still plenty of blue-collar workers in the U.S., but the trend was increasingly toward white-collar work. The typical American suburban wife also rose early. She dropped her husband at the train station and got home in time to put a quick breakfast on the table for the school children. Many U.S. families had 4 children, and some had as many as 6. As soon as the children boarded the school bus, the suburban wife started to clean. She wanted her house to be immaculate when the children returned from school, even though she knew it would all become messy again. By 10 or 11 that morning, she was out shopping and running errands, and by 3 p.m., she was home again, as if by magic, to receive the children. At 5 or 6 p.m., she picked up her husband at the train station, and the entire family enjoyed a hearty meal. This all sounds quite exhausting, but when one adds in the occasional visits to the family doctor or dentist, as well as the occasional football game or piano practice, it is simply remarkable that so much managed to get accomplished. How is all this possible? Many observers inquired. Hotels, highways, and fast food. President Eisenhower announced a massive restructuring of the nation's roads and highways in the mid-1950s. Millions of miles of new interstate highways were built. On their own, these made a significant difference in the lives of tens of millions of Americans. But when the new hotel industry and restaurants were added to the formula, the interstate highway system represented little less than a remaking of the travel habits of an entire nation. The American Automobile Association had been around for a decade, but its membership simply boomed in the 1950s and 1960s. AAA led the way both in automobile care and in the popularization of automobile and hotel clubs, meaning organizations that offered significant benefits to the typical consumer. Americans had more automobiles than ever before, and they had much better roads and highways on which to travel. The final element was the creation of an entirely new industry known as fast food chains. The McDonald's restaurant started as a family business in California, but it was bought out by millionaire entrepreneur Ray Kroc. Seeing the enormous potential, Kroc dreamed up the Golden Arches, which became the #1 symbol in fast food. Of course, he and McDonald's were followed by Burger King, Wendy's, and many other fast food chains. Hotels and motels sprang up along those same highways, with more choices for the consumer than ever before. It is no exaggeration to say that a family traveling across the U.S. in 1963 had a very different experience from one that did so a decade earlier. The means. Both the means and the method were uncomplicated. America's enormous industrial power, released during World War II, allowed the typical suburban family to live this amazing lifestyle. And America's prosperity was so strong that the typical household accomplished this with one wage earner and breadwinner rather than 2. The key lay in the standardization. The cars that used the same parts and the homes that were built using the same construction materials. There were 2 other elements, however, and these were the GI Bill and the low cost of home heating oil and gasoline. Officially known as the Serviceman's Adjustment Act, the GI Bill became law when FDR signed it in 1944. Specifically intended to make life easier for the returning soldier, the GI Bill allowed veterans to obtain home mortgage loans at very low rates of interest. The GI Bill also provided tuition reimbursement for GIs who wanted to further their education. Many, perhaps even most, of them elected to do so. The GI Bill made the good, or even the relatively affluent life possible for millions of former servicemen. But there was still another component, one that made the good life possible. During World War II, American business and government penetrated new oil markets around the globe. A tremendous amount of oil was necessary to fight World War II, and when the war ended, those markets remained, with relatively low prices. A typical U.S. consumer paid 25 cents for a gallon of gasoline, and sometimes even less for a gallon of home heating oil. As a result, the energy section of the typical American budget was far less than what we experience today. Of course, there was a cloud within the silver lining. Observers noted that the U.S. public and the U.S. economy became ever more dependent on imports of foreign oil, especially from nations in the Middle East. Most economists shrugged, saying things would remain that way for a long time to come. And so they did, right up until the Arab oil boycott of 1973, which is discussed in a later chapter. The total result was little short of miraculous. Many American GIs had grown up in the Great Depression, when there was often not enough food to eat. Now, their family tables practically groaned under the weight of Thanksgiving dinners, and the speed and mobility of the entire family, from the parents to the smallest of the children, was something amazing to behold. Beatniks and rebels. Not all Americans approved of the societal changes of the 1950s. Some highbrow intellectuals turned up their noses at the sudden importance of television, for example. But the most effective critics were not ivory tower intellectuals. Instead, they tended to be singers, writers, and poets. The Beatniks were a hodgepodge group, and they liked it that way. They did not strive for similarity. In fact, similarity and sameness were their biggest foes. The traveling poet Jack Kerouac was a leading beatnik, and the Eastern-inspired poet Allen Ginsberg was another. Ernest Hemingway, the great writer of the 1920s and 1930s, was not a beatnik, but many beatniks looked to him for inspiration. There was also more room for women among the beatniks, even though few of them became leaders of the movement. What the beatniks shared was a distaste for the consumer society that grew up in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The family suburban scene appeared to them to lead mostly to boredom and disillusionment. They encouraged young people to drop out of the consumer society and find themselves. Many beatniks received little honor or attention during the 1950s, only to receive a good deal of it during the youth movement of the 1960s. One thing the beatniks generally did like was the new music. The advent of the LP vinyl record made it easier for millions of people to hear the same sound and to experience music as if they were at a live event. Many beatniks declared they could live without almost all the modern conveniences, including the automobile and suburban home, but that they did need their music. Perhaps they sensed even greater changes were on the way. Popular music. In the mid-1950s, the typical American teenager was weary of hearing the big band music of his or her parents. Personified by Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington, the big band movement had been just right for the early 1940s and not bad for the World War II years. But the trend was now away from big bands and orchestras, with a new emphasis on small groups and sometimes even solo performers. Frank Sinatra grew up with big band music, but he moved to a solo act that lasted for decades. Sinatra came at precisely the right moment, allowing him to capture the tail end of the big band era and join it to the new solo performances. Many of his listeners were former GIs, and many of them remained his enduring fans for life. But the person who broke all the bounds, shattering the conceptions of popular music, was Elvis Presley. Born in Tupelo, Mississippi, in 1935, Elvis Presley moved to Memphis, Tennessee, when he was a young teenager. His home life was one of confusion and sometimes chaos. His personal life, even after becoming the king of rock and roll, repeated the pattern. But his music was something else, a whole new phenomenon. Elvis was not a great composer. He was not even that original a songwriter. But his performances were miles beyond anything previously seen. His first single was That's All Right, and his first album was Blue Moon of Kentucky. Right from the start, Elvis brought a distinctly Southern approach to music, but made it entirely his own. Many people who saw him live in the mid-1950s declared that all other music was ruined for them, and that they became devotees of the king and no other. Of all the remarkable Elvis songs, the one that cut the deepest was Heartbreak Hotel. Released in 1955, there is no way for words on the printed page to fully express the power of Elvis at his peak. He was the king, and in some ways, the true founder of rock and roll. Like many geniuses, he was a tormented person, and he died at the age of 42 at his beloved mansion outside of Memphis. Graceland remains an absolute must-see for true 1950s devotees. The others. To be sure, Elvis did not do it all on his own. A host of other writers and performers, some of them just as talented as the king, made their contributions. Tennessee was, in the late 1950s and for much of the 1960s, one of the centers of U.S. popular music. Stax Records, first established in 1958, recorded many of the great rock and roll acts, which included luminaries such as Otis Redding, Buddy Holly, and many others. What also did all of these writers, singers, and performers have in common? Many also recorded at Sun Studio in Nashville. They sought to wake Americans up from the slumber of their prosperity. Hard times had just as much to teach as the good times, they declared, and millions of Americans had sold their souls to the new prosperity. Another thing on which most of these performers agreed was the importance of live performances as opposed to recorded ones. They knew television had great power to bring music to the masses, but they often mistrusted its long-lasting effect. Early television. Radio was supreme until the early 1950s, when the first black-and-white television sets arrived at American homes. Television immediately became the rage. Radio was remarkable for its ability to send sound around the nation and even beyond. Television, on the other hand, sent image and sound, and when color television came in the 1960s, its appeal was even greater. Television had a more hypnotic effect than radio. Radio listeners tended to listen as a group and to have conversations about what they heard, while television could be a solitary event. Early programs such as I Love Lucy provided good laughs and set the standard for situational comedies. But the potential of television to influence minds was there from the very beginning. Advertising companies saw and seized upon this potential. Commercials for hairspray and new automobile tires punctuated the programs, and many U.S. consumers based their choices on what they saw on television. There was also the potential for highbrow programming, for news that could uplift as well as inform. Some of this potential was realized in television's first decade, and the most poignant program produced was a chilling mixture of reality and science fiction. This was The Twilight Zone, which debuted in 1959 and ran its final program in 1964. Never since then has a voice so captured the chilling power of modern technology as that of Rod Serling, whose narration began every Twilight Zone program. The great and obvious irony was that The Twilight Zone used television so effectively to convey its message about the darker aspects of advanced technology. The television president, John F. Kennedy, was almost universally regarded as the perfect television president, or as the made-for-television president. This is partly because of his youthful appearance and also because of his fine speaking style. The sometimes forgotten element is that JFK made many of his policy initiatives on television. Millions of television viewers saw JFK in the presidential debates of 1960, and millions of others heard him speak of the new frontier at the start of his administration. Kennedy envisioned the new frontier as the new areas of challenge for the U.S. Outer space was certainly part of JFK's vision, but it was not the sum total. Rather, the new frontier represented all the ways Americans could help and serve a hurting world. Not surprisingly, JFK's message was most heeded by young Americans. He established the Peace Corps just weeks into his presidency, and he announced the Alliance for Progress, intended to improve relations with South American nations. The great majority of JFK's New Frontier campaign played out on television. JFK seemed to have a special feel for the medium. He seemed to act without acting, to be guided rather than to take over the scene. His communicative magic was displayed many times, but perhaps the most powerful example came when he spoke to Rice University students about the importance of Americans going to the moon. This was JFK at his best, uplifting and exhorting the young people of America to join hands in a common direction. His speech was broadcast by radio, and it would have been a success if that were all. But because it was televised, beamed into the homes of millions of U.S. citizens, it became an even greater success. And the ideas and ideals of the space program became more evident. The space race. As we saw in a previous chapter, the Russian success in launching Sputnik proved alarming to many Americans. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration was founded, and America began training its first astronauts for a space race with the USSR. This started during the Eisenhower administration, and it continued to grow during Kennedy's White House tenure. America put its first man in orbit in 1961 and effected the first rendezvous in space in 1965. By the latter year, the U.S. was well ahead of the USSR in the race for space, even though this was not well known, even to the leaders of the U.S. government. The USSR did not have the massive funding to continue its early success, while NASA received larger budgets each year. By contrast, the Russians suffered one disaster after another and lost many of their best cosmonauts in the process. When the U.S. effected the first rendezvous in space in 1965, it was apparent that America had caught, and perhaps even surpassed, the Russians. One enormous goal remained, however. That was to see who would land on the moon first. The U.S. was very much in the lead in 1968, but NASA had tasted enough prior frustration to want all the I's and cross all the T's. The final step was a manned spaceflight around the moon, which took place near the end of 1968. U.S. citizens were able to view amazing photographs published in Life magazine, which revealed the great emptiness, as well as the captivating, almost hypnotic quality of space. The most popular photograph was entitled Earthrise, because it showed the Earth rising as the spacecraft came around the far side of the moon. Television played an enormous role both in launching the space program and in allowing the U.S. public to witness its success. The culminating glory came in July 1969, when 4 U.S. astronauts headed off into deep space. 4 days later, on July 20th, 1969, 2 of them landed on the moon, and stepping out from the lunar module, they became the first humans to set foot on its surface. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent only a few short hours on the moon, but before leaving, they planted a small U.S. flag. The implication was clear. America was first to the moon, and if there was to be another race, perhaps one to establish colonies in outer space, America would have the first claim. As it turned out, even the U.S. stopped sending manned flights to the moon. A total of only 12 persons have ever stood on the surface of the moon, and all of them to this date were Americans. Other events. To be sure, television did not only capture victorious sights and sounds. TV cameras were on hand when JFK was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas, in 1963, and television made his drawn-out funeral a national spectacle. Television also broadcast many of the painful moments of the 1960s, such as the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, both of which will be discussed in a later chapter. Television was perhaps most effective in showing the generation gap that developed in the late 1960s. The so-called generation gap developed between World War II-era parents and their baby boomer children. The war in Vietnam started in 1964, and the oldest of the baby boom children were just old enough to enlist. Many did so and were proud to serve the flag, but quite a few others had their doubts, and those doubts only grew in the years that followed. Television helped show the growing divide between the two generations. Never was it more apparent than in August 1969. Just 3 weeks after the amazing landing on the moon, nearly 500,000 Americans, most of them under the age of 30, gathered in upstate New York for the so-called Woodstock Arts and Music Festival. The festival organizers had hoped for 10,000 or perhaps 20,000 people. Instead, they drew the single largest outdoor crowd in U.S. history. For 3 days, the hippies and youthful rebels danced to rock and roll and folk music, declaring that this was the moment for their generation. Woodstock represented the height of the counterculture, a movement that worked against conformity to the financial, economic, and social system. This high point was captured by television, allowing millions of middle-aged Americans to witness the profound differences between them and their children. The assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy were all televised to some extent. The single most shocking event, however, was the shooting and killing of 4 young university students at Kent State University in Ohio in 1970. Television cameras were not on hand for the actual grisly event, but they captured the aftermath, which resulted in some of the largest protest marches of the era. The suburban home of 1975. Despite the many changes, some things remained the same. The suburban husband continued to board the train or subway, heading to work, and the suburban housewife continued to drop him off at the station in the morning. Something very different happened next, however. 2 incomes were usually needed to support the suburban lifestyle, and the housewife now worked at a job too. She tended not to work as many hours as her husband, but her hours at work were vital to keeping the family fortunes going. And for the first time, people referred to latchkey kids, meaning the children who came home before their mother returned from work. The family continued to have 2 automobiles, but they often elected to purchase more fuel-efficient ones. They continued to heat their home with heating oil, but they looked for ways to reduce their dependence. The children of 1975 had piano lessons and visits to the doctor or dentist, but some of them determined to reject the traditional values of their parents. Some suburban teenagers lamented that they were too young to participate in the youth movement of the 1960s and declare the 1970s to be a dull time. One thing had not changed. Television had, if anything, become even more important than before. Radios were still found in many homes, but only the older generation listened to them. Television reported on the events of the day, and it also speculated about the world of tomorrow. One of the speculations was about how computers would change American life. But that day had yet to arrive.